Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. This is my second episode in celebration of International Women's Month, and in this episode, I'm going to celebrate my favorite women in fantasy literature. This is something that's very close to my heart because I grew up reading and loving fantasy literature. Before I got into science fiction and horror, which have since become also my favorite genres of literature and film, for that matter, I really started with fantasy. I remember that I started at quite a young age. I was in primary school or grade school when I started reading fantasy. And I started with some of the greats that are until now considered modern classics of the genre. Like, for example, the books the Chanera Chronicles by Terry Brooks. Of course, you have Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And over the course of the many years that I've been reading fantasy literature, one of the things that has fascinated me the most is the strength of female characters, whether central characters or supporting characters. And there have been so many brilliant, fascinating, amazing, kick-ass women in fantasy literature through the years. And so I really wanted to celebrate them. And this is also my way of celebrating my love of fantasy literature and also sharing with you some recommendations, I suppose, because I'm going to also highlight why I love these books so much, why I love the characters so much, and the books that they're in. And so maybe this is a way for me to convince you also to start reading some of these books. This isn't really a ranked list, although I am going to save for last the characters that are probably my favorite or those that have resonated with me or have really had the most impact on me as I was reading and even afterward. But by and large, it's really just a celebration of the women that I love having read in fantasy literature and sometimes coming back to when I reread a particular book or a series of books. Before I head to my actual list, I'd like to mention one character from a series that I haven't actually read, which is a shame, but I have seen her in the Netflix TV series of the same name, and of course, I'm talking about The Witcher, and the character that I'm referring to is Yennefer. She's a fascinating character. She has fascinating abilities. Her magic is top-notch, and I think a lot of the characters that I love in fantasy literature are women with a strong willpower and strong conviction and a strong sense of self, to the point that they are willing to sacrifice some things and maybe even turn in a questionable direction from time to time, but they know what they want and they're really going after it. And add to that the fact that they have extraordinary abilities, far and beyond what others are capable of. So that's something that Yennefer has in the series. I'm pretty sure that I'll also like her character if and when I end up getting to read the book series, which I intend to eventually. And then I'd also like to mention quickly a particular series of books that I was able to read many years ago. I'd like to highlight it because it's probably one of the least popular series of books in the fantasy genre. In fact, there is no Wikipedia entry for each of the books. There is one for the entire series, which is good, at least. This is the Trillium series, which started with Black Trillium, which was published in the early 90s. What makes this a fascinating thing to discuss in this context is that it was written by three popular fantasy authors who all unfortunately have passed already, have left this world. And these are Marion Zimmer Bradley, Andrzej Norton, and Julian May. Really big names in fantasy and science fiction before they passed. And even now, of course, a lot of readers and authors revere them for their work in those two genres. Now, they came up with this project, or they jointly worked on this project, where the first book, The Black Trillium, which was great. There was a lot of criticism about its characters falling flat, and probably that was because there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. But I found the characters really fascinating. Those were Haramis, Anigel, and Kadia, who are sisters, and those characters were written from the point of view or conceptualized by Marion Zimmer Bradley, Julian May, and Andrzej Norton, respectively. And after that book, each one of them wrote a separate book on each individual character that they conceptualized. So I really like that idea, and that gave strength to women as central to the plot and really driving the narrative. And they were powerful characters in their own rights. They were fascinating characters, and I don't necessarily agree with the criticism that they were flattened or they were not as well developed as they should have been, particularly because there were follow-up books that really focused on each character afterward. Now I'd like to start my actual list of fantastic women in fantasy literature with the ones that I call the isekai girls. Anyone who watches anime would know what isekai is. This is the genre of anime and other forms of literature where you have people from Earth being transported to a fantastical land that is very, very unlike our own, usually very magical. So even before the term isekai was used to describe this particular genre of anime, there have been, of course, a lot of literature from many, many decades ago that have celebrated this trope. And I think we can easily say that some of the most popular characters ever in fantasy literature, some stretching all the way back to the 1800s, are these isekai girls. And given the description of what isekai is, I'm pretty sure that you can already think of who these are. You have from the Chronicles of Narnia, of course, the Pevensey girls. You have Lucy and Susan, particularly. And we all know their story. And we all know how sad Susan's story is, especially if you've read the Neil Gaiman story. And they hold the innocence, and which is a key to the magic of Narnia, which Susan basically loses. She loses that ability to see past reality and not be jaded and not be disillusioned by all the materialistic and horrible things in the real world or in our world. And that's what allows Lucy and eventually other characters in the Chronicles of Narnia to come back to Narnia, including Jill Pole, who I had actually met even before the Pevensey women, because the first Narnia book that I ever read was The Silver Chair, which had Jill Pole in it along with Eustace Crumb. And then you have, of course, from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, Alice, the quintessential English girl who goes into an adventure in another land where she meets all sorts of bizarre, colorful creatures, and makes you wonder what Lewis Carroll was high on when he was writing all of this stuff. And from a biologist's perspective, and my biology students would know this, and anyone who has studied evolution would know this, it has some ideas that are so fascinating that they've even been used in evolutionary biology, like what is called the Red Queen hypothesis, which is in one of my episodes. I'll provide a link there or there. And then, of course, you have the quintessential American adventuring girl who goes into another world, and that is Dorothy in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. And of course, who doesn't know her story, right? Especially if you grew up watching a lot of the classics of Hollywood and were able to watch The Wizard of Oz, starring Judy Garland as Dorothy. The Yellow Brick Road, The Wicked Witch, The Cowardly Lion, Scarecrow, The Tin Man, all of these are already fixtures of popular culture, just as Alice and Tweedledum and Tweedledee and the Cheshire Cat are also quite popular everywhere and have been portrayed in so many different versions, whether in film or television or even books, other books as well. And then, of course, you also have Wendy, Darling from Peter Pan. And essentially, all of these are coming-of-age stories, and in a lot of ways, them breaking into another world is also breaking into maturity, breaking into adulthood. They start off being very innocent, being naive in many ways, but their exposure to this new world opens up literally quite a new world, but it's something that they carry with them even when they get back to their own world. It's something that opened them up to the many possibilities that life has to offer, and it's really a very good allegory for growing up. I had mentioned earlier that one of the first book series that I ever read was the Chanera Chronicles by Terry Brooks. The first ever book I read in that series was, oddly enough, not The Sword of Shannara, which was chronologically the first in the series, published, I mean, because there's the first King of Shannara, which according to the timeline is actually first. But the first one I read was The Wish Song of Shannara, which featured a female character as the lead, and that's Bryn Obsford. Well, actually, the other lead was her brother, but they had two separate storylines. And this dark novel, which was very much unlike its predecessors, particularly or specifically Sword of Shannara and Elfstones of Shannara in terms of tone, introduced me to this whole new world of Shannara, which is one of the most fascinating worlds of fantasy that I've encountered, given that it is future Earth. Actually, despite its magical trappings, Bryn Obsford might not be one of the most independent or most well-developed characters in fantasy literature, but she was the one I began with in the book series. Eventually, I'd get to read Elfstones of Shannara, and of course, that has Amberly Elecidil, who is quite tragic, as anyone who has watched the MTV series Shannara would know. Unless they changed her fate there, I was never able to complete that series. And then eventually, I'd read the next trilogy by Terry Brooks in the series, and that's The Heritage of Shannara, which I also loved. Everything else is not good, unfortunately, although he would stretch on the series to many, many books with other new characters, including a new female character called the Ilse Witch, that's how you pronounce it. But the last memorable female character that I really encountered, and that was in The Heritage of Shannara, was one of the far-flung descendants of Bryn Omsford and the Omsfords in general, and that's Wren Omsford, who was a good central character to take a journey with. So Wren Omsford is a third good female character in a series that is otherwise not really known for very powerful female characters or very well-developed ones, taking a backseat to the male characters. Even Wish Song of Shannara, where Bryn Omsford is one of the two leads, in many ways the journey of her brother is more engaging, and her brother actually sought out to rescue her. So that tells us something about the early history of the Shannara novels when it comes to female characters, which Terry Brooks probably tried to make up for with the Ilse Witch, but again, that part of the entire franchise is nowhere near as exciting and as well written as the older books. Another series that I grew up reading was the Dragonlance series by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, who, of course, any self-respecting Dungeons and Dragons player would know. Even if they haven't read the books, they've probably heard about the Dragonlance setting, where you have the dragons, right, and a lot of sorcery, the trappings, the usual trappings of fantasy literature are all here, including a central gang of characters that you will fall in love with. Of course, you have Raistlin Magier being one of the most popular fantasy characters of all time, but we're focusing on the female, and there is no shortage of great female characters in this series. You have Laura Lanthalassa, the elf, who for a time was probably my favorite female character in fantasy literature. And then you have Tika Magier, Tika Wayland. She starts off as Tika Wayland. And Gold Moon. And then the anti-hero, which a lot of people love to hate, but also loved for her fierceness and no nonsense and really kick-assery. And that's Kitiara, the Dragon Rider. The Dragonlance series is amazing. I have not read it in a long while. The last time I read it was, I believe, I was in high school. So I don't know if I'll still love it as much as I did, but I'm pretty sure that I'll still really like the female characters because they were well-rounded, they were well-described and well-developed, and they were strong in their own right, even if characters like Tanis and Raisin Magier and Caramon Magier, for that matter, and Flint and Tasselhoff Barefoot, how dare I almost forget Tasselhoff, really were the primary stars of the series. Of course, we can't discuss fantasy literature without discussing the king of all fantasy franchises, and that is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. More people have probably watched the movies, which I love. They're still my favorite movies of all time. Then there have been people who have read the books. And definitely the movie and the filmmakers, Peter Jackson, particularly took liberties with the female characters, particularly Arwen. And for a time, it became controversial because she became a warrior woman when in fact in the books she wasn't much of one. But Eowyn was always going to be a kick-ass character, whether in the books or in the movies, because of what she does with the Witch King of Angmar and saying, I am no man. Right? Female empowerment at its best. And whether in the books or in the movie, she was that character. She really was that character who really showed that even in this universe where it's a man's job to protect the Middle Earth and to save everyone, you have this character who goes against all of these conventions, particularly the conventions of Rohan, and fight for liberty, fight for the life of her friends. And that certainly makes her one of the most noble, selfless female characters in fantasy literature. Of course, if we want to talk about someone with great power among the female characters, we have to mention Galadriel, the Queen of the Elves of Lothlorien. And she was portrayed excellently, perfectly, by the ethereal goddess herself, Cate Blanchett, in the movies. Now we're really warming up because I'm going to that part of the list where I'm really highlighting female characters that I think blew it out of the park and really made their respective books as great as they were because of their presence, because of how they were written by the authors. And they're a big part of why these books are successful in the first place. First, we have from Philip Pullman's brilliant, incomparable series, his Dark Materials, Lyra Belacqua, one of the most hard-headed and stubborn and adventurous female lead characters that you'd ever read about in fantasy literature. There has been a movie made of The Golden Compass and a TV series, starring Daphne Keane of Wolverine fame. And she's great in the character. She captures that stubbornness and that strength of character and will that Lyra Belacqua is really known for. And that propels that trilogy, that very, very intelligent trilogy. It's also coming of age. It's one of the best coming of age tales out there, actually. And it's beautiful, it's bittersweet and tragic what happens to her life as she comes of age and she realizes that the world is so much bigger than what she thinks. And a big part of what makes her character so well-rounded and so likable as well is the fact that she has an external manifestation of her soul, and that's Pantalaimon, her daemon, and that's another glimpse of her that we see. So we're actually seeing two of her at once, given that her soul is manifested as Pan. So that's as much her as he is a separate entity. On top of that, his Dark Material series is just one of the best ever, regardless of genre. From the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, we have Vin, a street urchin who realizes that she has the ability to do allomancy, which is one of the most amazing, intricate, unique magic systems in fantasy literature. It's unforgettable the way it uses metals and pulling and pushing, and that's something that the Mistborn can do. She realizes that she's part of the Mistborn group or class of people, despite growing up in the streets. And it's a fascinating universe. The world building is amazing, and that's something that Brandon Sanderson is so good at, and that's why he was chosen by the Jordan Estate to complete the Wheel of Time series when Robert Jordan passed away. He's so good at world building, and he's so good at handling female characters. Another reason why he was brought in to finish Wheel of Time, which is very much known for female characters. So spoiler, you know what's coming up later. If you like the characters in Arcane, which actually shares a lot of common themes and flavor with the Mistborn series, then you'll like Vin. And her journey from start to end, from the first book to the third book, is nothing short of engrossing and endearing. And it's something that you will really end up investing in. And she just happens to really have the most amazing power set that you can totally imagine, either as the most crazily choreographed action scenes in a live action movie or an anime, which is probably a better fit to capture the insanity of how these characters move. And Vin is also very strong-willed, which is, I think, one common thread that runs through most of these female characters: the convention and the strength of will that they have to overcome the challenges to women, even in these fantasy worlds, but to humanity in general. Now, one of the other fantasy series that I really enjoyed reading, but I never got to complete it because it sort of fizzled after like the fourth or the fifth book, was the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind, the late Terry Goodkind. Goodkind was also able to build a great world with amazing characters, among them a group of females called the Mord Sith, who use their magical abilities to torture in very graphic ways, in very, very painful ways, and they're probably worth highlighting given that this is a video about women in fantasy. And Kara, who starts off being a major literal pain on Richard, the lead character Richard's life, as a Mord Sith, eventually ends up being one of his strongest and most loyal allies. And I love how Kara develops as that. And definitely, she's worth highlighting as one of the biggest and most important female characters in that series. But of course, the queen of all women in that series is no less than Cailan Amnell, the Mother Confessor. To this day, after having read so many fantasy novels, for me, the abilities of the Confessors in this universe are still among the most intriguing, exotic, and powerful, actually. Particularly the Mother Confessor, especially when she goes into this rage. I forget what it's called, if there is a name for it. And she does that quite a few times, especially when Richard, the love of her life, gets seriously hurt, and she can be vindictive, and that actually comes with her power set. Cailan Amnell is definitely one of the most richly developed female characters that you can encounter in fantasy literature, particularly in modern fantasy literature. She is very human in terms of her fragility and in terms of her failures, but she's also very strong. And again, the conviction that she has. She can be petty, she can be vicious, she can be selfish, but she's also very nurturing and very loyal and very steadfast. And that's really a genuine human character. It just so happens that she has the powers of a minor goddess with her Mother Confessor powers. I regret not being able to complete her journey through the book series. Maybe I'll get to that eventually if I manage to find the time to finish it and the motivation. Maybe just thinking about how Richard's and Cailan's story finishes is motivation enough, especially because of how great a character she is. Maybe I just needed to record this video to remind myself and to give myself the push to finally finish the series. Now, when you saw the title of this episode, you were probably thinking about one particular character, but then you were wondering, is this video going to include only high epic fantasy, or is it going to include also young adult fantasy? Of course, I actually love young adult books, and I have no prejudices against particular types of fantasy. And of course, this list cannot be complete without the one, the only, Hermione Granger. Hermione, the know-it-all, the one who recites the most in any classroom, who annoys people sometimes because of that know-it-all attitude, but ultimately is one of the fiercest and most loyal friends you can ever have. One of the most intelligent as well, one of the most naturally gifted, and someone who fights against the destiny that the world has laid out for her given her Muggle origins, and someone who has such passion for service and her causes, like the cause for the house elves. She is a wonderful role model for children growing up. And in fact, we can say that she introduced a whole new generation of readers to powerful, intelligent, mature girls who have the best characteristics that you can hope for in a mentor and in a friend. And following her journey from the first book all the way to the last is nothing short of riveting and endearing. And we can't help but invest in her story. And then of course, if you think about the movies, from 2001 onward, we see Emma Watson, who perfectly captures Hermione, literally growing before our eyes. And if you didn't tear up seeing how it ends in the movies, I don't know why. I did, because it was such a long journey. And Hermione Granger simply happens to be one of the best, most well-written female characters in all of literature, I can say. Now we're down to the last two fantasy series that I'd like to highlight. This first one is probably more popular than the one that I'm reserving for last, and that's really because of the HBO series that won a slew of Emmy Awards. We don't need to talk about how that season ended. I myself don't hate it as much as many people do, especially those who irrationally hate it. But talking about the book series, really, we cannot deny how wonderful it is. I started the book series way before the TV series started, so I was one of those fans that really felt so lucky that we can watch this all play out in a TV series. And of course, even all the way to the end, it was one of the most brilliant TV series ever to air on TV. And of course, some of the most amazing characters in that series are women. There are many to choose from. You have your own favorites, I'm sure. But for me, there are two that I'd like to really highlight, and those are, of course, Daenerys Targaryen, she of many titles, the Mother of Dragons, the Khaleesi, and Arya Stark. Both of them have very fascinating journeys. They begin very differently. They are taking very different journeys right now in their character development, in their character arcs. But I think each is just as riveting as the other. Of course, you have Arya Stark going the more unexpected route, judging from how she started. She's tomboyish, she's she's mature beyond her years. She's headstrong, which is one thing that we usually love about these characters. And she's forced to mature earlier than she should by tragedy in her family. And this pushes her to a completely different land with a completely different culture. And she's probably going to change so much more than any other character in the book. And of course, we're speaking about the book series, which is notoriously not yet done, infamously not yet done. J.R.R. Martin, please finish it as soon as you can. And then you have Daenerys Targaryen, who, again, disregarding what we saw in the TV series, we're not even sure if that's what's going to happen to her in the book series, is also has a journey that we can't help but be invested in. From that tragic beginning that she had in book 1, all the way to what we're seeing already on her way to possible queendom. Definitely she's going to be competing for the throne, that much we can tell, at least from where the books are right now. But come on top of that, the fact that she has 3 dragons and she's the only one in the world, as far as we know, that has dragons, what can be more amazing than that, right? And she can hold her own with her intelligence and her wisdom and her fierceness as well, even without those dragons. And she has had to go through so much. Again, without thinking of what happened to her character in the TV series, I think both Daenerys and Arya are characters that we are really rooting for. We can't help but feel that they deserve the best. And so, I'm really excited to see where their characters are going, as I'm sure you guys are if you've been following the books. And finally, we get to the last book series that I'd like to highlight in this episode, and this is the colossal, gargantuan juggernaut of them all, the biggest one with the most books, with the most characters, because I think there are over 200 characters in this series, and many of them, probably more than half of them, are women, and they are among the most powerful women you can encounter in fantasy literature. Whether you're talking about the side of the villains, where you have the Forsaken like Grendel and Lanfear and Moghedien, or the mostly heroic Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones, with all of the Ajas of the Aes Sedai, which makes for such an amazing power system, amazing group of women, with and of course we all know how manipulative, how controlling, how much puppetry the Aes Sedai do on a socio-political level. They play the Game of Thrones really well. And then you have the Wise Ones of the Aiel, who are also unyielding and stubborn and all sorts of powerful in their own right. Really, the Wheel of Time series is the best fantasy series to read if you want to read strong female characters. Bar none. Really. I think Robert Jordan created one of the most fascinating worlds with one of the most brilliantly designed magic systems, the one power, all of the weaves, and the colors of the Ajas based on what they represent. And the way they shape the world is nothing short of impressive. The handle that they have on how the world works is a big part of what drives this universe that Robert Jordan has created and Brandon Sanderson eventually finished. And I mentioned a while ago why Brandon Sanderson was really the best fit or the best choice to finish the book series that Robert Jordan started. Now, having mentioned these groups of women, of course, I'd like to highlight specific women. We have, of course, the one who started it all, the one who brought Rand al'Thor out of the Two Rivers. We have Moiraine the Modred. And we have two of the women who were part of that group that was whisked away from their idyllic village life. And those are Egwene Alvir and Nynaeve Almira, who would eventually both become some of the most powerful Aes Sedai in history. Spoiler alert. And then we have the mini harem of Rand al'Thor, consisting of Elaine Trakand, Avienda, who is an Aiel, and Min Farsho. Only one of whom we have met in the TV series, and that's Min. And all of these women have such interesting backgrounds and storylines. Each one of them has a hook that really makes you get invested in their story. But for me, my favorite has always been Nynaeve Almira. Not only because she ends up being one of the most uber powerful and OP female characters in existence, everywhere. Her grasp of the one power is epic, but also because she's so stubborn, headstrong, no nonsense. She has a lot of flaws, and she retains a lot of those flaws throughout her journey, but she's also fiercely loyal and protective of her friends and her loved ones. And that dimensionality of her character is really what makes her and the other female characters in The Wheel of Time among the best that you can read in any genre. In fact, I can confidently say that in any genre, if you want to read about powerful women who shape the world with their femininity and their power, which comes in different types, then Wheel of Time really is the perfect book to read if you are willing to read so many books, and each one of them is like 400 to 600 pages. But it's really worth the effort. It won't really be an effort because the series is so well written and the world building is amazing. And here, Robert Jordan really celebrates women because he creates a world where they are world changers. They are shapers of the world. Either with gentleness and maternal instincts or with the complete opposite. Regardless of what side you're looking at, there's no denying that women shape the world of Robert Jordan. Much has been said about the characters of women that we must celebrate their nurturing aspect, their love, their passion, but also their strength of will and conviction. And these are things that run through the thread of all of these female characters in fantasy literature. You add to that mix the magic, the sorcery, the martial weapon expertise of some of them, and the leadership capabilities. And you just manage to bring out all of these things that we celebrate about women in general. And I sincerely believe, because of this, that fantasy literature is one of the best genres to turn to if we want to see the power of women and their ability to shape the world with all of these characteristics that we celebrate in both chapters and pages of a book and in real life. If you like this episode and you would like to see more about fantasy literature, about women in various genres, about popular culture and science in general, please don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content in the future. Bye!